Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. This is the story of Catherine "Catty" Blauvelt, a 22-year-old woman with no known enemies, no criminal history, and no reason to vanish. But in late October 2016, she did, without warning, without her phone, without her car, and without a trace. 2 days later, she was found, not at home, not in a hospital, but in the basement of an abandoned house, a broken knife still lodged in her neck. It began as a missing person call. October 25th, 2016, Greenville County, South Carolina. Caddy's co-worker at PetSmart placed a report when she failed to show up for her scheduled shift. Her parents had assumed she stayed overnight with a friend. The family had only recently welcomed her back home following a separation from her husband. They didn't press her when she wanted space. She had her own room again, her own routine, and according to her text that afternoon, she was tired but good. But what nobody realized at that moment was that by the time that message was read, Caddy was likely already dead. The recovery of her body came the following day, October 26th, when a group of teenagers exploring an old condemned property stumbled on what they initially thought was a mannequin. By the time first responders arrived, it was clear that the woman lying in the dirt had been there for more than 36 hours. No one had reported screams, no break-ins had occurred nearby, and nothing at the scene suggested robbery or assault. In fact, everything about the body placement, the absence of scattered belongings, the clean entry route, the tight positioning, indicated that this was a controlled act, calculated, quick. Someone had killed her, and someone had intended to hide it. Her identity was confirmed through dental records and a wedding band found on her finger. Catherine Blauvelt. 22. Recent separation from spouse. No known mental health history. Clean employment record. No outstanding debts or legal issues. A background so clean that, initially, it raised more questions than it answered. Crime scene investigators noted several inconsistencies inside the basement. The door had not been forced open. It was accessible from the rear of the house through a gate that had rusted off its hinges. The floor bore a faint trail of boot prints, appearing then disappearing near an oil spill across cracked concrete. One latex glove fragment, torn, blood-stained, was found under the back stairwell. No weapon was recovered, but the blade found in her neck was a cheap military-issue folding knife, the kind commonly found in surplus kits. The absence of drag marks suggested she was killed in the basement. The lack of blood trails leading in or out pointed to an efficient disposal. Her work shirt, still buttoned, indicated she had not been changed post-mortem. The coroner estimated time of death between 9:30 and 11 p.m. on October 24th, less than 3 hours after she had left work. Her phone, however, never left her home. That detail stopped everyone. Caddy had reportedly texted a friend around 9 p.m. saying she'd be around later, and her family recalled hearing the door close shortly after. But her phone remained plugged in on her nightstand, and there were no rideshare receipts, no text from any known contacts inviting her out. So why had she left, and how? That mystery only deepened when her car was found parked exactly where she'd left it, in her parents' driveway. It was locked, keys inside, no fingerprints on the door handles other than her own. The car hadn't been moved since Monday night. Detectives began a hard review of Caddy's personal history. Her recent marital status was noted immediately. She had separated from her husband, John Blauvelt, just weeks prior. He was a recruiter for the U.S. Army, based in Greenville County, and had been on personal leave. There were no reports of domestic violence, but a few texts recovered from Caddy's tablet hinted at tension. One, dated 10 days before her death, read simply, "He's not handling this well." Another, "He's watching, I can tell." At this point in the investigation, no official suspect had been named, but it was standard protocol to interview spouses in violent death cases. John Blauvelt was contacted by the Greenville County Sheriff's Office. His phone was off. Messages left with Army personnel yielded no answer. When officers visited the address he shared with Caddy months earlier, the place had been cleared out. He was gone. It didn't take long to realize that Blauvelt had failed to report to duty for over a week. His last confirmed location was a gas station in Columbia, South Carolina, 2 nights after Caddy disappeared. He had been seen traveling with a minor, a 17-year-old girl whose identity was not immediately released to the public due to her age. Records later confirmed she was enrolled in a nearby high school and had last been seen getting into a gray sedan registered under Blauvelt's name. Within 48 hours, the missing persons case had become a murder investigation, and within another 24, the suspect had become a fugitive. But detectives didn't need to jump to conclusions. They had a body, a timeline, and a location. What they needed was science and patience. DNA samples from the glove and blade were rushed to the forensics lab. Trace fiber collection began around the crime scene, with a particular focus on the fibers lodged in the concrete near the basement steps, a pattern consistent with wool-blend military uniform pants. At the same time, the digital forensics team began reconstructing Caddy's last known digital activity. Her phone was off. Her smartwatch had disconnected from the network at 9:41 p.m., just minutes after she likely stepped outside. But one signal remained, a ghost ping from a cell tower located just a few blocks from the abandoned property, a short-lived GPS handshake. Not enough to track movement, just enough to say she was there. And then, nothing. No outbound calls, no 911 attempt, no messages, not even an unlock screen event. The phone in her room hadn't moved, which meant whoever picked her up that night had done so on Caddy's trust. Not by force. Trust is a forensic detail in itself. It doesn't show up under UV light or on blood panels. But when someone leaves their home without keys, without a purse, without a phone, they expect to return quickly. Or they know the person waiting outside. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but the outline was still incomplete. What remained was motive and movement. Where had John Blauvelt gone? And more importantly, why had he taken a teenager with him? As detectives pieced together the route, new agencies were looped in. Army Criminal Investigation Division, FBI Fugitive Task Force, and U.S. Marshals. A BOLA was issued nationwide. Interviews were lined up with Caddy's co-workers, friends, classmates, but none of them had seen her with anyone suspicious. None of them knew about the girl, and none of them had any idea why someone would want her dead. No suspect had been named publicly, no charges filed yet, but quietly behind closed doors, law enforcement had already placed a name at the top of their working file. At this stage, everything remained speculative, but the data didn't lie. And sometimes the data lining up too cleanly was the problem. Because when a timeline fits too perfectly, when it narrows too quickly, it means something's missing, or someone made sure of it. In most cases involving a missing spouse, the first interviews focus inward. Spouses, partners, live-in exes. Investigators know that when a person vanishes, the closest relationships are often the starting point. Not because they're always guilty, but because they're the first to know when something isn't right. What stood out in the case of Catherine Blauvelt wasn't what her estranged husband said. It was what he didn't. John Tufton Blauvelt never asked if she was okay, never asked where her body was found, never followed up with law enforcement. The man legally still listed as her husband vanished from South Carolina within 48 hours of her disappearance. He stopped showing up to his Army recruiting station. He disabled his phone. And according to military records, he never requested leave or filed any formal resignation. He just walked off the grid. Detective Mark Jensen noted in his field log, dated October 27, 2016, initial outreach to Mr. Blauvelt unsuccessful. No call back. Recruiting office supervisor reports last contact was 3 days prior. Subject did not notify chain of command. Flagged as AWOL. That alone was not grounds for arrest, but it was enough to escalate the case from domestic homicide to federal interest. When a uniformed service member disappears in the middle of a homicide investigation, and especially when he was last seen with a minor, it activates cross-agency response. Within days, Army CID and U.S. Marshals had joined Greenville County's task force. A multi-state BOLA was issued. The forensic team, meanwhile, began building a profile based on physical and digital evidence, starting with confirmed timestamps of Caddy's final known movements. The PetSmart closing camera showed her leaving at 8:37 p.m. Phone activity stopped at 9:02 p.m. By 10:42 p.m., her smartwatch disconnected from its home Wi-Fi signal, suggesting she'd stepped outside. GPS placed her within a 2-block radius of the abandoned house. What connected those gaps was no longer hypothetical. On October 28th, A traffic cam pull from a nearby intersection revealed a grainy but identifiable image. A gray 2007 Honda sedan turning onto East Standing Springs Road at 9:58 p.m. DMV records matched it to John Blauvelt. What narrowed the suspicion was the passenger profile. The passenger seat was occupied. Too small to be an adult male. Not Caddy, who never entered the vehicle. Not her belongings, which remained untouched. The timestamp aligned with the projected time of death. The location aligned with the GPS drop. The vehicle, investigators believed, had been used to transport the killer to the scene. Later that week, a forensic sweep of the crime scene revealed a partial boot impression under a warped plywood board at the base of the basement stairwell. It was shallow, not bloodied, but it had pattern continuity, a specific arch only seen in two types of military-issue tactical boots, one of which was standard issue for Army recruiters stationed in the Southeast. The print was entered into the National Footwear Reference System. John Blauvelt had no known criminal record, so nothing came back. But a request was made through military logistics to acquire his last issued gear. That request stalled when base officials reported they couldn't locate him or his gear. He'd taken everything. On October 30th, a subpoena was filed for Blauvelt's banking and mobile records. He had closed his main account 3 days prior. All withdrawals had been made in cash from local ATMs. Surveillance at one location, Bank of America, East Butler Road, captured him withdrawing $680 at 5:23 p.m. on October 25th. He was alone, calm, no visible signs of panic or urgency. By this point, law enforcement no longer operated under the assumption that he would return voluntarily. He was categorized as an active deserter and a person of interest in a homicide. The more the team dug into Caddy's digital life, the more disconnected it became from the narrative Blauvelt had told friends, that their separation was amicable, that she had become distant. Messages uncovered from her cloud backup revealed she had made inquiries about divorce forms, housing assistance, and had scheduled a consultation with a counselor at her former high school. A handwritten checklist found in her room outlined specific tasks for October 25th. Call legal aid, pick up prescriptions, return key. None of those tasks were completed. When questioned, her family confirmed she had expressed anxiety but wasn't suicidal. She was actively rebuilding. Nothing about her final weeks suggested withdrawal or self-harm. Her decision to move back home had been motivated by safety and stability, not isolation. The forensic lead in a recorded strategy meeting remarked, "We're dealing with a subject who planned this ahead of time, knew her patterns, knew how to move undetected. He's not running scared, he's executing." On November 1st, law enforcement received a tip from a gas station clerk in Florence, South Carolina. The clerk had seen a man matching Blauvelt's description, traveling with a teenage girl. They purchased snacks, a burner phone, and left quickly. Security footage later confirmed the sighting. The girl was Hannah Thompson, 17, a local high school junior who had been reported missing by her mother on October 25th. Her disappearance had been treated as a possible runaway. Now it was reclassified. The connection between Blauvelt and Hannah shifted the nature of the case. It was no longer just about finding a killer. It was about finding two people, one of whom had been taken across state lines as a minor. The FBI filed federal unlawful flight charges. Blauvelt's face appeared on wanted posters across Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and as far west as Nevada. But each time the trail warmed, it cooled. He used cash. He avoided toll roads. He changed appearance. And he left no cell signal. What he couldn't erase was the data. Investigators traced his use of prepaid cards, noting a purchase made under a pseudonym, Ben Klein, at a Walmart in Texas. A jacket found at that location was later confirmed to carry dog hair matching Hannah's pet. Another print on the receipt bag matched a latent palm print recovered from Caddy's home bathroom light switch. The connection was circumstantial, but the pattern was building. Each forensic thread stitched tighter. Every physical artifact pointed away from random violence. There was no forced entry, no external struggle, no unknown DNA. What was left was movement, intent, and planning. At this stage, investigators made a conscious decision. Stop treating it as an open homicide. Start treating it as an active fugitive operation. The case was now twofold: what had happened in Simpsonville and where he had gone after. Back in South Carolina, a lab report finally confirmed a mixed DNA profile on the interior cuff of the latex glove. One was Caddy's. The second was unidentified, but it was male. It was preserved, sealed, and entered into CODIS. No match yet. Sometimes in cases like this, the biggest mistake the suspect makes isn't at the crime scene. It's believing the trail disappears with them. It doesn't. It just goes quiet for a while. In homicide investigations, there are moments when the case seems to stall, not because evidence is lacking, but because every piece aligns too smoothly. The timeline, the location, the motive. It fits in a way that suggests resolution. But investigators understand that a perfect picture without depth can signal something else. Manipulation, not clarity. By November 2, 2016, law enforcement had already secured forensic data from the crime scene and surveillance that placed a gray Honda sedan near the abandoned house. They had partial DNA from a torn latex glove and a military boot tread in oil-stained concrete. They also had confirmation that the victim's estranged husband had not only fled the state, but was now traveling with a 17-year-old girl who had not returned home since October 25th. Despite this, what remained missing was physical proximity, proof that tied movement to the moment of death. To move the case forward, forensic investigators turned to the most overlooked materials at crime scenes. Fibers. The lab team at SLED, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, analyzed fiber samples recovered from beneath Caddy Blovelt's fingernails and around the hem of her shirt. Initial analysis showed a blend of dark green polyester and nylon consistent with military-issued uniform fabric. The weave and thread count narrowed the match to a specific manufacturing lot used between 2013 and 2015 for Army Combat Uniform ACU pants. The key detail wasn't the presence of the fiber, it was the location. Embedded in a compressed angle between her shirt's underarm seam and bra strap, the transfer likely occurred during direct physical contact. Not brushing, not movement, direct pressure. Detectives pulled archived personnel records and requisition logs from Fort Jackson. John Blauvelt had been issued 4 ACU pants during his service period in South Carolina. No returns were logged, no replacements issued. To strengthen the fiber correlation, the lab conducted a secondary analysis on trace materials recovered from a discarded hoodie found in a Florence SC motel trash bin, part of the trail believed to have been left during the fugitive's first days on the run. The hoodie contained one long blonde strand of hair, a cluster of animal dander, and 2 short green fibers with an identical dye structure to those recovered from the victim's shirt. It was the first time both locations, crime scene and escape route, linked via physical evidence. Meanwhile, the victim's autopsy report finalized. The report confirmed time of death as between 10:15 and 10:45 p.m. on October 24th, based on liver temperature and rigor stage. Wounds were consistent with a folding blade approximately 3 to 4 inches in length, single-edge serrated. The fatal injury was a deep stab to the right carotid artery. 2 defensive cuts along her right forearm suggested she had blocked at least one initial strike. No evidence of sexual assault was found. No alcohol or narcotics in her system. This was not a crime of impulse or intoxication. It was calculated and fast. While forensic labs closed in on physical threads, digital investigators continued mapping John Blauvelt's last known activity online. Using IP tracking, they located a login attempt to a now-deleted Gmail account from a mobile hotspot in rural Alabama. The account had been used to create a temporary rideshare profile weeks earlier. Though no trips were logged, the creation time, October 22nd at 3:15 a.m., predated Caddy's disappearance by 2 days. Why create a travel account if no intention existed to use it? That question gained weight when financial records uncovered a purchase at a local Army-Navy surplus store, 1 prepaid flip phone, 1 burner SIM card, and a travel-sized first aid kit. Cash transaction, October 23rd. No loyalty tracking. Investigators retrieved security footage. John appeared alone, unshaven, wearing civilian clothes. No interaction, no conversation. He entered, selected items, and left within 6 minutes. The puzzle was no longer a question of whether he was planning to disappear. It became a matter of when he had begun preparing. One significant detail surfaced during a re-interview of a former co-worker at the recruiting station. The co-worker recalled an offhand comment from John roughly 2 weeks before the crime. According to the written statement, he said something like, "She thinks she's leaving, but she doesn't understand what that means." The co-worker dismissed it as frustration until they saw his face on the news. For investigators, statements like this, while not admissible proof, add contextual weight. Combined with physical evidence, they reinforce intent. And intent in a homicide case carries legal gravity. But the case was not yet closed. The suspect remained at large. Hannah Thompson was still missing. And though a federal warrant had been issued, jurisdiction across multiple states complicated surveillance and extraction. Back in South Carolina, Caddy's family waited. They had provided every photo, journal, and message they could find. One journal entry, written 3 days before her death, read, "I'm tired of walking on eggshells. I'm not afraid of being alone anymore. I just want peace." It wasn't evidence, but it was clarity. It showed she wasn't running. She was trying to rebuild. In cases like this, victims are often spoken about only after they die, reduced to case numbers, bullet points, or crime scene photos. But behind every forensic detail is a human life. Catherine Blauvelt wasn't just a profile. She was someone who made the decision to leave a marriage quietly, to move home, and to take back control of her future. That future ended in a basement, not because she was reckless, but because she trusted someone one last time. Between October 25th and December 12, 2016, John Blauvelt left no digital footprint that could be traced in real time. For someone who had lived a structured life within a military system, where every movement, phone call, and financial transaction could be documented, that silence was abnormal. He hadn't just vanished. He'd preemptively erased his trail. The first forensic confirmation of deliberate evasion came from a forensic audit of 2 prepaid phones, purchased separately, one in Columbia, South Carolina, and one in Mobile, Alabama. They were activated within 48 hours of Catherine Blauvelt's disappearance. The first device pinged a relay tower less than 4 miles from the abandoned house in Simpsonville, precisely at 11:02 p.m. on October 24th. The signal lasted under 5 minutes before disconnecting completely. The second device activated in Alabama on October 29th and was never used to make a call, text, or access the web. This behavior suggested intent to avoid passive tracking. No SIM linking to personal identity, no GPS location sharing, no logins to known email or social platforms. The second device's IMEI had been previously used in a burner phone operation in a separate fraud investigation in Louisiana, raising suspicions that Blauvelt had researched or mimicked criminal flight protocols. Evidence continued surfacing in fragments. Surveillance footage confirmed Blauvelt and Hannah Thompson were seen together at a rural gas station outside Birmingham. No interaction with staff. The girl looked disoriented. He paid in cash. No card use, no loyalty number, no license plate captured clearly. Across jurisdictions, this created friction. Greenville County could no longer issue local warrants. The Army's CID had limited authority off base. The FBI had full jurisdiction, but required corroboration of interstate movement involving a minor. Until then, agencies had to share leads without shared control. By early November, gaps in coordination allowed the trail to stretch farther west. What stood out wasn't just how he escaped, but how little contact he maintained. There were no ransom notes, no taunting messages, no staged red herrings. His strategy was silence, not chaos, and for 6 years it worked. By late 2016, forensic focus shifted from identifying how Cathy Blauvelt was murdered to understanding how her suspected killer anticipated the digital net around him. Analysts began comparing the methods used in his disappearance to SOPs from survivalist forums and anti-surveillance manuals. One pattern repeated: minimal use of fixed networks, regular cash withdrawals in even amounts, and staying off interstates. A financial report from a regional bank in New Mexico later showed a cash deposit under the alias Benjamin Klein, not a common name, but not obscure either. The handwriting on the deposit slip matched samples from Blauvelt's military file. It was indirect, but it was traceable. The deposit occurred in early 2017, months after the case had cooled in the public eye. This was the first verified sighting since Alabama, and it reframed the investigation. John wasn't just hiding. He was living under constructed identities. Quiet, calculated, undetected. Back in Simpsonville, Catherine's family had no closure. With no arrest, no trial, and no clear narrative, public attention waned. The victim's story became a cold case headline, briefly revived when law enforcement issued new composite sketches of Blauvelt with altered hairlines and facial hair. But each press cycle ended the same. No progress, no return. In mid-2018, a re-evaluation of forensic data from the original crime scene revealed a new detail. A single degraded fingerprint lifted from the inner flap of the glove found beneath the basement door was reprocessed with updated software. It yielded a 13-point partial match, not enough to confirm identity, but enough to elevate the urgency of locating Blauvelt. The sample was preserved, sealed, and moved to federal custody. Technically, the case was open. Practically, it was suspended. What it left behind was a gap not in evidence, but in presence. A victim with no closure, a suspect with no accountability, and a system stretched thin across state lines and years. By the time the next major break occurred in July 2022, the trail had been dormant for more than 5 years. But law enforcement never removed Blauvelt from their radar. His name remained on interagency watch lists, flagged for ID checks, housing registrations, and labor records. What they needed wasn't more data. They needed one mistake, and eventually they got it. It was a Wednesday in July 2022 when the routine shifted. A quiet clerk at a social services office in Medford, Oregon, filed a report that didn't look urgent on paper. A man calling himself Ben Klein had submitted identification that felt incomplete. Temporary ID, no proof of residence, no employment records. But what caught her attention wasn't what he brought. It was how rehearsed he sounded. The report wasn't filed as a criminal lead. It was forwarded to a regional database as a possible ID fraud. 3 weeks later, during a routine weekly cross-check, a federal analyst flagged Ben Klein for review. The reason? The name was now associated with more than one inquiry across multiple states: South Carolina, New Mexico, Alabama. None of the paperwork connected, but the handwriting did. A latent print from the 2016 Simpsonville crime scene, recovered from a torn glove, was re-entered into the updated AFIS system in early 2022. No match had come then, but by the time the Oregon report arrived, the system had evolved. A 13-point partial fingerprint match was confirmed between the glove and a federal military ID registration belonging to John Tufton Blauvelt. It wasn't conclusive enough for conviction, but it met the threshold for probable cause. U.S. Marshals began surveillance in Medford. The man calling himself Klein worked at a small mechanic shop under the table. No insurance, no bank trace. He lived in a trailer behind the shop. He had no vehicle registered under his name, no social media, no cell phone subscription. He paid cash for groceries, moved only at night, changed barbers every few months. What broke the case wasn't the forensics, it was the routine. An agent posing as a county property inspector visited the shop under the guise of a zoning violation. Hidden cameras captured the subject's movements: height, gait, speech pattern, each detail cross-referenced with old Army files. The biometric match was 92% confidence, enough to move. On July 20th, 2022, marshals took him into custody without incident. No weapon, no resistance, just one sentence: "I knew this day was coming." At the time of his arrest, he gave a fake birthday, refused to sign documents, and invoked counsel. His fingerprints, confirmed again at the federal level, closed the identity gap. After 6 years, John Blauvelt was no longer a fugitive. Back in South Carolina, the victim's family was notified within hours. For years, they had held annual vigils, watched case coverage fade, and endured silence. Now they were asked to prepare for a trial. Forensic review of Blauvelt's possessions in Oregon revealed items kept deliberately neutral: no photos, no mementos. But one thing stood out. In his personal notebook, under a list of names and dates, there was one entry circled in pen: Catherine, 1024. No confession, no statement, just that. For law enforcement, the arrest marked closure in a logistical sense. But from an investigative standpoint, the years he spent evading capture were equally important. He had survived without traditional documentation, employment, or consistent digital presence. He had built a second identity from scraps and nearly sustained it. Cases like this aren't only about justice. They're about infrastructure. The way one missed detail in 2016 can ripple for years, delaying closure for families and exhausting systems meant to protect them. The break came not from a breakthrough in tech, but from diligence in process, a pattern of anomalies observed, reviewed, and finally connected. Justice didn't arrive quickly, but it arrived. After the arrest in July 2022, the focus shifted. Law enforcement had their suspect in custody, but they didn't have a confession. And after nearly 6 years, time wasn't on their side. Evidence degrades. Witness memory fades. Legal thresholds evolve. The case would be built on forensic sequencing, trace analysis, and procedural discipline. Anything else was noise. Blauvelt was extradited from Oregon to South Carolina in August 2022 under a federal escort. He did not speak during transfer. No statements were made to investigators. No interview requests were granted. He invoked his right to counsel immediately. The legal process began with a grand jury hearing, not with a press conference. The prosecution team knew what they had and what they didn't. There were no eyewitnesses to the murder, no security footage inside the abandoned house, no signed admission of guilt. What they had instead was a layered, circumstantial case, reinforced by consistent forensic anchors and movement data. The chain of custody began with the latex glove fragment recovered under the basement stairwell in 2016. DNA analysis had produced a partial male profile that, while not a complete match, excluded over 99% of the population. The match to Blauvelt's known genetic markers wasn't absolute, but it met the admissibility threshold set by state law. More importantly, the glove's inner lining also carried trace epithelial cells consistent with Caddy's DNA, suggesting contact had occurred. Next was the fiber evidence. Laboratory technicians had isolated distinct green nylon strands from the victim's shirt. A comparative fiber sample taken from Blauvelt's old Army combat uniforms, located later in a storage unit tied to a relative, showed identical dye composition and manufacturing signature. These fibers were not mass market. They were part of a specific contract order issued in 2014 for Southeastern recruiters. The digital forensic data filled out the movement narrative. A tower ping from a prepaid phone purchased by Blauvelt the day before the murder showed activity near Simpsonville between 10:40 and 11:00 p.m. on October 24, 2016. That window matched the estimated time of death provided by the autopsy report. The phone went offline permanently minutes later. Its IMEI had never been reactivated. Geolocation cross-mapping added another layer. Traffic camera footage placed Blauvelt's registered vehicle near East Standing Springs Road, less than 30 minutes before the victim's GPS watch disconnected from its home signal. The car wasn't tracked returning to her home. Investigators inferred the trip was one way. In court preparation, the prosecution structured the case around 5 forensic pillars: physical trace, digital movement, timeline convergence, behavior after the fact, and absence of alibi. Individually, none of these would guarantee conviction, but together they created a consistent framework pointing to a singular conclusion. One of the most damaging pieces of post-arrest evidence was found not at the crime scene, but in Blauvelt's Oregon trailer. A personal notebook contained lists of names, cash totals, and dates. Most of the entries referred to logistical matters, jobs, routes, cities. But a final section simply titled Loose Ends included 2 names underlined, Catherine and Simpsonville. The date listed next to them, 10/24. The defense attempted to suppress the notebook, arguing its vague content lacked direct relevance. But the court ruled it admissible, citing context within the timeline and the suspect's behavior patterns. Cotty's family attended the preliminary hearings. They were not asked to testify, but their presence was constant. The courtroom was quiet. There were no interruptions. Blauvelt's demeanor remained unchanged, silent, composed, uninterested. In the pretrial phase, prosecutors also relied on procedural credibility. Officers who had maintained evidence integrity were brought in to testify about storage, transport, and lab verification. Nothing had been contaminated. The glove had never been opened without authorization. The digital logs had been preserved by a third-party forensic contractor. Chain of custody documents were complete, signed, time-stamped. While the defense raised questions about gaps in direct evidence, no murder weapon recovered, no camera inside the basement, jurors would eventually be reminded that forensic evidence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's consistent. Silent patterns build louder than any testimony. By early 2024, the trial was scheduled. The charge, murder in the first degree. Additional charges included obstruction of justice and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. This wasn't going to be a quick conviction, but it was no longer a cold case. Justice, as it often does in real-world homicide investigations, came in fragments. The law doesn't promise speed, but it does require effort, rigor, and respect for the truth, especially when a victim is no longer able to speak for herself. When court convened in September 2024, it had been nearly 8 years since Catherine Blauvelt's murder. The prosecution understood the stakes clearly: no eyewitnesses, no confession, and a timeline that relied heavily on forensic interlocks. The defense knew it too, but this was no longer about who disappeared. It was about whether the data could speak clearly enough to convict. Jury selection took 3 days. The presiding judge issued firm guidance. No discussion of Blauvelt's military background beyond logistical relevance. No mention of his fugitive status outside what could be tied directly to premeditation or consciousness of guilt. The state adjusted accordingly. They didn't open with emotion, they opened with facts. The prosecution's strategy began with structure. They broke the case into segments: timeline, trace evidence, digital forensics, behavioral analysis. Each segment had a specialist. Each specialist linked a single piece of evidence to the next, so no one point had to carry the entire weight. The first forensic expert took the stand with evidence from the crime scene: the glove fragment and its mixed DNA profile. The partial male sample had 14 points of identification against Blauvelt's known profile. Statistically, that placed the odds of a false match in the range of 1 in 18 million. Not absolute, but statistically solid. The trace epithelial cells on the inner lining linked it back to the victim. Cross-contamination was ruled out via chain of custody logs and cleanroom documentation. Next came the fiber match. The nylon fibers found in Caddy's underarm seam were visually indistinct, but under spectroscopy, they carried a matching chemical signature with fabric sourced to a discontinued military uniform line. Blauvelt had been issued uniforms from that lot in 2014. No one else connected to the case had. The timeline evidence followed: surveillance images, vehicle trace, the prepaid phone pinging near the crime scene during the projected time of death. The expert testified about triangulation margins in cell tower logs. There was no ambiguity. The phone was in the vicinity of the abandoned house at the same time Caddy's smartwatch disconnected and her phone remained untouched at home. Every point of contact, each ping, each footprint, each fiber was laid in order. Not dramatized, just confirmed. The defense attempted to introduce doubt by emphasizing the absence of a murder weapon. They pressed witnesses on the limitations of partial DNA profiles. They noted the fibers could have transferred during previous contact, but these arguments didn't break the overall structure. There was no alternative suspect, no alternate explanation for the sequence of movements, the use of a burner device, or the flight from the state within 24 hours of Caddy's disappearance. One of the more compelling moments came not from a forensic expert, but from the detective who had worked the case from the start. He wasn't asked to speculate. He was asked to detail what was recovered from Blauvelt's trailer in Oregon. Among the items, a notebook, a burner phone, SIM pack, and a single sheet of printer paper. On it, a timeline of departure dates and coded references. 1024 done was listed. Handwriting analysis confirmed it matched Blauvelt's known signature. The defense tried to discredit it as circumstantial. The prosecution used it to show consciousness of the timeline. Intent, they argued, was built not in the moment, but in the days before. Closing arguments avoided sensationalism. The state emphasized convergence. Dozens of data points, from lab-confirmed fibers to geolocation hits to matching boot treads, each pointed to one conclusion. No one else had the opportunity, motive, or documented contact. The defense reiterated their position: absence of direct evidence, lack of confession, and the risk of convicting based on patterns. But in homicide trials, especially those involving forensic reconstruction, patterns matter, especially when they repeat across location, timeline, and behavior. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. Verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Additional convictions followed for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution and obstruction of justice. Sentencing was immediate: life without the possibility of parole. Cotty's family didn't speak to reporters afterward. They had no prepared statement. Their presence through every hearing, every motion, had said enough. What remained was not closure, but finality. The legal system had done its part. What the community remembered was that Catherine had been quiet about her fear, methodical in her attempts to leave, and silenced not by chance, but by control. This trial didn't rely on courtroom theatrics or dramatic confessions. It relied on physical evidence: small, silent, technical. And that evidence spoke clearly when it mattered most. On May 21st in 2024, nearly 8 years after Cady Blauvelt's body was discovered in a vacant Greer home, John Blauvelt was convicted of her murder. The jury returned a unanimous verdict after less than 3 hours of deliberation. The courtroom was silent when the decision was read. No visible emotion from Blauvelt, no outburst, just the rustling of the court recorder and the dull click of his cuffs as deputies let him out. The sentencing was swift. On May 22nd, Judge Keith Kelly ordered Blauvelt to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. South Carolina had removed parole for most violent crimes after 1996. There would be no early release, no time shaved. For John Blauvelt, the path forward was fixed: Department of Corrections custody until death. But even as the courtroom emptied, the case wasn't fully closed, not in the eyes of the legal system. In March 2025, Blauvelt filed a notice of appeal, claiming procedural errors during trial. Among the points raised, the admissibility of certain Facebook messages and the handling of DNA evidence collected in 2016. The appeal has not yet been ruled on as of June 15, 2025. His defense team declined to comment further, citing ongoing proceedings. John is currently housed at Broad River Correctional Institution, a Level 3 maximum security facility in Columbia. According to records, he has been placed under protective watch, not for suicidal risk, but due to concerns about his prior status as a police officer. DOC protocols routinely isolate former law enforcement from general population inmates for safety. There is no public remorse, no statement of regret from him. In the court transcript, the only words he uttered during sentencing were, "I didn't do it." The jury and the weight of the physical and digital evidence disagreed. Cody's family chose not to give televised interviews after the verdict, but her sister read a short impact statement in court. She said, "We waited 8 years, 8 birthdays, 8 Christmases. While you lived like a ghost, she stayed buried. But today, finally, her name is cleared. Her truth is proven. We will not speak your name again." That silence says more than outrage ever could. For investigators, the case left a deeper bruise. Blauvelt was not just a murderer, he was a badge holder, a trusted officer sworn to protect. Records later showed that during his time as an officer in Simpsonville, no disciplinary warnings were issued. No domestic complaints reached his department, but neighbors of the Blauvelts said otherwise. In statements gathered post-arrest, 2 reported hearing shouting at night. One said Cady once left the house with visible bruising, claiming she fell. None of that reached internal affairs. None of that was documented. The pattern is not unique. According to a 2022 national study from the National Center for Women in Policing, domestic abuse rates among law enforcement households are estimated to be 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. Yet internal reporting remains remarkably low. Officers investigate each other. Silence often protects the uniform. Cady's case became part of a training curriculum by late 2024 for cadets in South Carolina's Criminal Justice Academy, not as a procedural study, but as a warning. A unit now titled Danger Behind the Badge includes her case as a cautionary tale on background checks, domestic abuse response, and officer accountability. Justice in this case did not arrive quickly, but it arrived. Cady Blauvelt was 22. She worked a retail job. She liked animals. She'd once considered becoming a teacher. She was not a headline until her life was taken. But in the quiet persistence of those who refused to let her case fade, her name now stands for more than tragedy. This case was not solved in a moment. It took forensics, digital footprint analysis, persistence by Greenville and Greer investigators, and public pressure to resurface a file that might have gone cold. It also demanded recognition that domestic violence doesn't always look the way we expect. It can wear a wedding ring or a badge, and sometimes it hides behind both. The evidence held, the truth held, and in the end, justice held. Sometimes justice takes time, but silence should never be part of the timeline. Watching this case unfold reminded me that danger doesn't always come from strangers. It can come from the people we trust most, in the systems that fail to see it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never be afraid to speak up, even when no one believes you yet. Someone will. And when they do, it could change everything. What do you think this case says about trust, abuse, and the justice system? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, even a little, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next case we uncover together. Your voice matters here.